In 2015, Peter Oborne, the sort of famous British journalist, came to Open Democracy and told us that he had resigned from the Daily Telegraph and he wanted to write for us about why. So he sent us his, he wrote us this kind of resignation letter, which explained that he refused to, he stood down from his post at the Telegraph because they were not properly covering this scandal around HSBC at the time, as he saw it, because the Telegraph relied a lot on advertising revenue from HSBC. In fact, he gave various other examples where he felt that the Telegraph's editorial priorities were being dictated by the interests of its main advertisers. And he thought that was journalistically unacceptable and he could no longer be their chief political commentator. And so he resigned. And that, blew up enormously and became a huge story. And so on the back of that, we started to think about, how can we try to understand how corporate power is influencing media coverage more generally? And so we did a bit of work around the Westminster election in 2015, and then we had a big project around how corporate power is influencing coverage of the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. So I kind of monitored the media in the cover-up to the Paris Climate Conference, and I went to the conference and looked at how the process of journalism was working there and how the various lobby groups were working there, and I wrote a lot about that and covered that quite closely. I wrote this piece based on my research before the conference, looking at the media coverage and after it, called 6 Ways to Spin Climate Coverage. It looked at the various different ways this happens, some of which are more honest from the media and some of which are maybe more dishonest. So, for example, in the New Statesman, which is a generally good magazine, I think it's at the better end of this, they had the only coverage of kind of energy or climate issues they had before the conference was a piece of what's called sponsored content, where it's labelled, you can see it's in sponsored, but it was a large feature by EDF, the big French energy company, who are major polluters. They have the filthiest coal power stations in Europe, about how nuclear power is the solution to the climate crisis. And of course, there's reasonable people who can disagree about what you think about nuclear power. You might have different positions on that. But the fact that the main sort of magazine in the British left only had one way to cover this issue, which was getting a major corporation to tell them the answer, was very worrying. And what that's about is the fact that newspapers and magazines are losing huge amounts of revenue as advertising goes off to Google and Facebook. And so they just don't have the journalists to write about this stuff often. So it's not that the New Statesman is a kind of evil outfit. They were honest about what this was. They said it was sponsored content, but it's still very worrying about our media landscape. The second is what I call advertising and coincidental coverage, where I find numerous examples, and I won't name them all here for in case they want to sue me, but numerous examples which you can see in my article of publications where there would be a sort of advert for a company here, and then a couple of pages later there'd be a sort of weird puff piece about that company, or about how you should do a thing that company would want, that wouldn't normally, you'd think, make a newspaper. So for example, one paper had an advert for an airline and then a whole article that would just kind of wrote about how this airline makes sure that you get exactly the food you want, and how it has this clever software system. I mean, all you need is a spreadsheet. It's not that complicated to make sure that customers get the food they want. So it was kind of a very strange, coincidence that this airline had bought a whole page of coverage and suddenly there's this, article about how great they are. Or another one was like a magazine which was advertising shares in crude oil. There was an advert for that, and then there was their financial advisor was saying that now is the time to buy shares in crude oil, which of course is very worrying. You think about, your grandparents and maybe their pension money and how they could be suddenly throwing it into something which turned out to be terrible advice. Is this guy saying that you should do that because that's what he believes, or because the advertiser has told them? And then there are various other examples of this, but perhaps the most pernicious was about this story in the Daily Mail, I think it was, which said that there'd be blackouts if we had too much renewable energy, and that this winter we were looking at blackouts because of how much renewable energy there was. And it turned out, actually, and another group has done research on this, but it turned out that the tabloid press has run that story every year for 6 years based on basically the same report that's been essentially copied and pasted by a right-wing think tank every year by the same expert who doesn't appear to have any academic credentials, making the same claim every year. And in that period, there have been no blackouts caused by renewable energy coverage. So they have this same scaremongering story placed there by a right-wing think tank who won't tell you who's paying for their work to get the story into the papers, which terrifies people about the dangers of renewable energy. And so I suppose what worried me about all of that is it shows how rich organisations, and of course rich in this case largely because they're linked to the fossil fuel industry, one of the richest industries in the world, can shape the way we talk about energy policy, we talk about environmental policy through a kind of dying media that doesn't have the journalists to fact check stuff anymore. And that means that, all of the narratives, all the stories we hear about this stuff are often put there by big business. So what was most fascinating for me about the British journalists at the conference is they were focusing very closely on the negotiations. And the journalists who were there were good, hard-working, honest journalists who were doing a great job on the whole. But there weren't enough of them, usually. The week before the conference, the Telegraph sacked this guy, Jeff Lean, who had been the UK's first dedicated environmental correspondent. That journalists are losing their jobs rapidly, and things like climate change often lose reporters first. So there weren't nearly enough journalists, and the ones there were, what they spent their time doing, understandably, was following the actual negotiations in the room very closely. But of course, anyone who knows about politics understands that no decision is really made in the room. And so I spent my time going around, along with, in one case, my colleague Kyla from DSMOG, to the various other events on the fringes, which a lot of the lobbyists were running, and which often kind of the various people who are working for government would go to. And what we found is, we went to, for example, an oil industry event, and we were the only journalists in the world at this oil industry event at the Paris Climate Conference, where we basically got, Shell to say that, sure, in public we're saying one thing, but actually what they believe in private is, a set of quite different things. So they pretended to support the aims of the Paris Climate Conference, which are that they, a 2-degree cap on carbon emissions. I asked them, I said, but any 2-degree cap on carbon emissions would mean that you couldn't burn the oil in your reserves. And of course, Shell's balance sheet is based on the fact it's got the oil in its reserves. And so if it's not allowed to burn it, then Shell is currently bankrupt. Shell's balance sheet relies on saying, well, these are the assets, these reserves that we have. And, so how can they possibly say they support a 2-degree cap, which would in fact make them bankrupt as a company? And, and Shell's, head of climate change kind of said to me, well, they don't really think there will be a 2-degree cap, and actually like 3 or 4 degrees maybe is where we're going, and, kind of essentially admitted that, what they were saying in public and what they were saying in private didn't quite stack up. So that ties in with some more recent revelations from Greenpeace and The Guardian, who kind of went undercover and did this sting on a think tank called the Institute for Economic Affairs, where it turned out that one of the main funders of the IEA throughout the 1990s, and in fact for a very long time, has been BP. And throughout this period, the IEA were very actively involved in kind of spreading stories about how climate change wasn't really a thing, and it wasn't. We shouldn't worry about climate change, and basically climate denial stories. Throughout that period, BP were pretending to be. They changed their branding to Beyond Petroleum. They pretended to be the green company, and so on. So all their marketing was, we understand this is a problem, and we're going to solve it, and so on. But quietly, they were also paying other people to say things they didn't want to say in public about how climate change isn't happening and spreading doubt and so on. And if we think about how the climate has changed now, and people have died this summer because the climate's changed and will continue to die because of this, and how we didn't take the opportunity in the 90s and in the 80s when we knew about this problem, we think about how companies like BP pretended to care about this problem at the time, but in fact were also paying the people who were going around making sure that there was no action taken on this problem, then we see a huge problem in the way that political propaganda works in this company, and the fact that the media didn't really hold them to account at the time and still don't hold them to account. And I think what's interesting that's changed in the last even 3 years is that we've seen this massive growth in alternative media outlets as people have started to realise that if they want journalism to hold power to account, then traditional journalism is dying, and people have started to realise they need to fund alternative media outlets to do this work. And in the environmental space, there's more and more great people doing that. Of course, us at Open Democracy do it, but also people like DSmog and lots of others have done some really important work holding this power to account and revealing these stories. After the Paris Climate Conference, when we've been looking at this corporate influence over media coverage, we decided to have an investigation more broadly into corporate influence over media coverage. And Jim Cusick joined Open Democracy, who had been a senior journalist at The Independent, and he's done some great investigative work on lots of things, but including into George Osborne's editorship of the Evening Standard. And he revealed earlier this year that Osborne and his team were offering kind of editorial coverage that money can't buy in the Evening Standard. And there are various companies who had been approached to essentially buy editorial comment in the paper, which normally is meant to not be allowed. Normally it's meant to be that you can buy an advert, but the journalism is independent. And what this showed was that he was offering to kind of blur that line a lot. And one of the major companies that was involved in this was a big agribusiness firm. And I think it's important to understand that the reason that agribusiness companies are swarming around the government and the press and propaganda and lobbying at the moment in Britain is that the EU spends more money on the common agricultural policy than anything else. More than anything else, financially, it's an agricultural union, and it, in some ways, has protected us from sort of the worst of the pesticides and herbicides that might be poisoning our water supplies and killing our animals than, for example, we see in the States. The CAP is totally flawed and it does lots of bad things, but it's generally better than most other regulated spaces. And these companies are desperate to be able to sell their products in the UK after it leaves the EU. And so they're pushing their messages very hard within the media and at the government. And how we manage that process of Brexit and make sure that we don't end up being sold off to kind of big agribusiness firms is going to be a huge challenge in the coming years. I think that people have learnt in the last few years that ultimately power in a country lies in the hands of the citizens of that country, and that if we organise together and we work hard and we understand what we're doing and we invest in the kind of media we need and we build our own movements, then we can see off these threats. These things aren't inevitable. The capacity to change the country is huge. There's a general understanding in Britain that the systems of governance we have, the economic system we have, are both broken, and we can come together and fix those. And of course, big, powerful interests are going to try and exert their influence, but if people organise together and work together, they can absolutely stop that. And in a sense, all of these stories are in a way stories of hope, because ultimately what's happened is that we have managed to find these people trying to do these things. We have managed to expose them, and often, that's humiliated them enough in itself that it's in some ways stopped them doing those things, or at least slowed them and made it harder for them. So I think that, absolutely all these stories can be quite depressing, but the fact is that, work hard enough, build social movements, work together, and you absolutely can stop these things from happening.